So the home stretch of the US presidential election final weekend here. Who's gonna win? What is astrology telling us about who may win? Is astrology even equipped to address the problem of who may or may not win this election? These are questions heavily on my mind as we get close to what appears to be a neck and neck race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump to see who is selected to be the new leader of, America. So we know that in the recent weeks, Trump surged in the betting odds, went way ahead of Kamala Harris. A lot of people were saying that was because of rigged betting markets, Peter Thiel and friends able to rig those markets using offshore gamblers to run up the odds in favor of Trump in the betting markets leading up to the election. We've seen in the last few days, though, Harris has surged again. And as we get closer, we're seeing that the betting odds are looking more and more like what the polls are telling us. These pre-election polls, again, have shown a similar surge in Harris's favor, particularly in states like Pennsylvania right up into the late last week and into the weekend. So several polls have her leading in Pennsylvania, which appears to be the key swing state that could tip the election for Harris. That said, effectively, it's a toss-up. It appears to be a toss-up. That's what most polls are saying, pollsters are saying. Well, I don't know about you, but it just feels like information silos more than ever. I was on X Twitter looking at stuff and it's just totally Trumpism, diehard Trumpism. I got off that app because I was like, this is crazy. And then I went to something like Reddit or YouTube. Those appear to be more balanced and probably pro-Harris with their leans or the way that they're presenting the information. But it does appear to be a silo of two worlds. And if you click some commentators, they're reading all of the information saying the data supports Trump. And then the others are saying, well, the data supports Harris. So it's really hard. It's like this split and this bifurcated dichotomy. Remember, Jupiter's in Gemini right now, expanding the nature of the two worlds, the twins, the split. And in America's chart, the Sibly chart, Gemini comprises the seventh. So there's the self, which is the nation, and then there's the opposite of the self, which is the other. And Gemini is that split around others or the othering. But Sagittarius, the rising sign of the Sibly chart, is also what we call a double-bodied sign, a mutable sign. And so there's this nature of two that's embedded in the American experience in the American natal chart. And I think we're seeing that now more than ever. And just as an aside, I was on a live stream with a few of my astrological colleagues, Alex Harper, GBT, and Gary Caton. And we went into our prediction analysis, and it was 2 for 2. So you can see even within a smaller subgrouping of astrologers, you have 2 for Trump, 2 for Harris in terms of their reads of the charts. Now, if you go outside of a subset that's restricted, so those are just 4 astrologers on that show, and you go to a larger survey of astrologers, the SkyScript website, as it's done the last 2 elections, is showing an aggregate of astrological prediction. A lot of big name astrologers have been aggregated into that higher level summary, and that website has Harris out ahead dramatically. It's like 70 for Harris, 30 for Trump. And just so you can put that into context, the last election, more astrologers predicted Trump. It was closer, but there was an advantage Trump. And then the election before, of course, advantage Hillary. And I mean, just on that SkyScript aggregated election prediction thread. Mark at SkyScript does a wonderful job on that. He's staying on top of it and adding astrologers day to day, right up here until the finish line. But most astrologers, by a wide margin, say Kamala Harris will win. And so will astrologers finally get an election right? We've been wrong the last 2. Well, in the aggregate, astrologers have predicted the Harris victory. Well, we'll find out this week. Hopefully, if the results come in this week. This idea that astrologers get it wrong, that the aggregation of astrological prediction gets it wrong or has tended to get it wrong, really raises some deeper questions about what is astrology, what is it good for, how should we use it, and is predicting an election even the best use of astrology? I don't think it is, and I'm going to get to more of that later, so stay tuned for that discussion a little bit later in this video. And so while I see no reason to change my prediction, I mean, I've been writing the Harris prediction since, I think, June 2023 is when I first released that video. Maybe it was May when I did the research around it. The Saturn and Pisces cycle indicates a continuity of power in terms of the party in power staying in power. And that cycle's been pretty darn good in American history to predict the results of presidential elections. So I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to change horses midstream in this video or anything like that, but I want to come back in because the Aries Ingress for 2024, my analysis of that and the breakdowns that I've done heretofore about the election, I was sort of reading it a little bit wrong. And it was funny, with World Astrology Report, I did a long forecast with Dan Waits and Steph Koithman. And in that, I remember distinctly recording about how Saturn is bona fide because the rays of Jupiter and Venus enclose Saturn in that Aries ingress chart. And so there's this powerful Saturn in Pisces that has great strength because of that benefic enclosure. And yet when I pulled up the Aries ingress chart to do astrological presidential prediction, I just forgot that. I just wasn't quite as keyed into that. Now I was aware of Venus in Pisces with Saturn, bonifying Saturn because Saturn is with the powerful exaltation ruler, but when you add in that mutual reception with Jupiter and then the enclosure, it really gives Saturn great power. And in the Aries ingress technique for predicting presidential elections, that Saturn is assigned the party that is not in power, the opposition party. So the Aries ingress analysis was kind of leaning Trump, in fact. And that said, I've looked back at many of these Aries ingress charts and they're not always correct, or even the Libra ingress charts when those are used. Sometimes that technique just gets it wrong. You have a really strong ruling planet and that party doesn't win. You can look at the Libra ingress of 1980 and it showed Mars and Scorpio in the 10th. And of course, Jimmy Carter lost, whereas the opposition party won. So that's an example where just because you have a really strong ruling planet of the 4th or 10th house, it's not always determinative. Anyhow, I'm not changing my prediction, but that has given me a little bit of pause, and that might explain why there's this, where Trump's hanging in there. He's doing quite well, at least by some polls and in some ways of measuring. This may be my last presidential prediction cycle, no matter what happens, even if Harris wins. It's just something that, I don't know, it feels like a coin flip in a way, and it feels like definitely not the highest and best use of astrology. And I'm just not sure it's how I want to engage in my astrology as much going forward, which is the crystal ball, this is your future kind of stuff. I just don't think astrology really is set out for that. While it can speak to it, don't get me wrong, it's not the highest and best use. And I can say there's big astrologers I know, some huge astrologers that have refrained from sharing predictions because they don't think it would fit with their brand, or they don't want to offend their audience, or they just don't want to get caught wrong. And that tells me really what I need to know about astrology's ability to predict, is that if there was a strong ability to do it, the best astrologers wouldn't hesitate, right? They would just make their predictions because astrology works to capture that function. And because it doesn't, and it's not the best use of astrology, people won't make predictions because they don't want to be exposed or seen as flawed in terms of the wider audience. And so that's what I want to close here with, is a little bit of a meditation on what is the highest and best use of astrology. What even can astrology tell us about the future if it's not this crystal ball, this person is going to win? And I want to turn to Stephen Forrest, very wise astrologer, someone I respect greatly. We have different technique and different style in terms of how we practice nuts and bolts, but I think his methods for interpretation and his philosophy of astrology is something that's very useful. And so in the 2016 election, many astrologers predicted Hillary Clinton, just like the pollsters, and they all got it wrong. And in the aftermath of that, there was a real triggering within the astrologer community about, is prediction even the best use of astrology? And so Stephen Forrest was writing about it, and he wrote this article in 2017, and I want to quote him here. He says, "I think the idea that astrologers can see the future has done us nothing but harm. We cannot see the future. Probabilities, yes. That's why our predictions are often correct. Questions and issues, certainly. There is the heart of our craft." And then he says, "ISAR made a mistake simply with the premise of the panel. It is time for a major paradigm shift in astrological thinking." He's saying that the fundamental premise that we see the future with astrology in literal terms is a flawed premise. And so if we're going to build out media or discourse around that, we're flawed out of the gate. And I tend to like that model because I do think that the premise that we can see the future is flawed. Astrologers are not fortune tellers. We don't know the future as much as anybody else. What we have and what our great power is that we can read a symbol set that is a two-dimensional representation of the planetary movement. And that connects us to the future. Because at any moment in time, you have a captured two-dimensional symbol set of meaning. Our skill is that we know how to read that map, because this is a rich tradition of studying the planetary symbols and deriving meaning from those symbols. And so what astrology can do is restrict the domain of meaning, and it can invoke certain questions surrounding topics in our future that allows us to align or link with the symbolism of a moment in time, such that we can advance our causes by aligning ourselves and grooving with the reality of a certain symbol set that is very real. Those measurements are real. And that is what has great power, because there's something about the synchronistic nature of reality that there are layers of meaning. And when we can align with those layers, somehow that opens something up. And as a natal astrologer, I've done many, many readings, and it is predictive. I mean, it can very much work when you say, all right, Saturn's about to come to your 7th. You're going to have some lessons in the area of primary partnership. Saturn enters the 7th, and now there's a serious discussion with maybe a part-time boyfriend about that becoming a serious committed relationship or a marriage. It's often surprisingly literal, and sometimes it's not exactly operative. But I do think there's great value in exploring the potentiality and using the symbol set to trigger question and then working within that. Astrology as a processing tool is the next way that I like to use it, is that when life emerges, we use the symbol set to process. So for example, let's say back to this person who has Saturn newly in their 7th house, and then the boyfriend is proposing. Having no idea about astrology, then they go to an astrologer, and the astrologer says, hey, this is the time to take seriously your relationship and maybe think about longer term commitment. And that might help them process the event that has happened and seriously consider that proposal. So we contour theme with astrology. And back to the election, that's what I think is the highest and best use of astrology right now. We can wait and see the result of the election. Once we know the winner, we now can have a much better sense about the next year, because we know what's going to happen next year. Neptune will enter Aries, resonant with the US Civil War. Uranus will enter Gemini, resonant with World War II and the Civil War and the American Revolution. And so whoever wins will somehow be playing a major role in those cycles and those resonances. And this is partly why I still think Kamala is maybe going to win, is that I just can't see the Civil War scenario as easily unfolding with a Trump victory. I think that Kamala Harris wins and it becomes pretty clear that there's like a Stop the Steal 2.0, and that's where you get this tension. Half the country is like, oh, Harris isn't the president, not my president, we really won. And you're already seeing it in stories this week about irregularities that are being reported by, you know, the Republican side. So to me, that's the easier way to get to the Neptune and Aries resonance, which is splits in America and dissonance internal. But it's not the only way to get there, and it may be wrong. You know, Trump may win, and then we have a Trump version of that with Trump at the helm. But it's just an example. Once we get the result, we can process. We can begin processing reality through astrology. And then just the one final point is that there's an astrologer, Capricorn Research, a British astrologer based in Australia. He's predicted all of their elections right. So he got Trump right, he got Biden right. There was only like 5 astrologers. I went back to mark at Skyscript's lists and tried to find those astrologers that picked both Trump and then Biden. So they were not in the majority, both in 2016 and 2020, and he was one of them. And I don't remember the others, but his work just came across my radar earlier. I just saw it in one of my feeds. And so I went to his site, and he's predicting Harris using progressions. So, you know, that's just a close. I think there are great astrologers who've predicted elections well, still predicting Harris. I am still thinking the Saturn and Pisces cycle might hold. Whatever happens, I wish you a great week ahead, and I wish you, settlement around your politics. I wish for you some kind of peace of understanding, spiritual peace. Maybe there's some ways of transcending this, no matter the outcome, if it's the one you want or the one you don't want. So take care out there this week, and a little bit of just enjoy the show. I mean, I'm kind of thinking about, it's like a movie, popcorn. I'm going to be watching those polls and enjoying the show a little bit. I think that a little bit of levity around it can help us palate the gravity of the political implications one way or the other. So I'm S.J. Anderson. You can find me at sjanderson144.com, my website. There you have all my socials, links to YouTube, links to my Patreon, behind the scenes videos, live streams, my newsletter. You can get all that through Patreon. And then my Instagram, you can see some of my photography and some of my writing about astrology, which I publish there periodically. Have a great week. Take care. US election week. Peace to you. Best.